mid-1970s, New York City was on edge. A toxic combination of financial turmoil and an uptick in crime led to a new nickname for the Big Apple, Fear City. Between the summers of 1976 and 1977, the city had something else to be afraid of. Within 13 months and across 3 boroughs, 6 people were dead and 7 more were wounded thanks to a killer armed with a .44 caliber revolver. The murderer taunted police and media alike with unhinged letters that were signed the Son of Sam. After months of no leads, a parking ticket near the last shooting was the catalyst that led police to Yonkers and David Berkowitz. The 24-year-old postal worker chillingly told the officers, "You found me," as they surrounded his car. Berkowitz ultimately pleaded guilty to 6 counts of second-degree murder and 7 counts of attempted second-degree murder. The killing spree and media mayhem that followed still receive international attention. Josh Zeman, director of the documentary series The Sons of Sam, A Descent into Darkness, joins Forbes True Crime to discuss the infamous case, as well as his series that explores investigative journalist Maury Terry's theory that Berkowitz wasn't the only shooter. Hi everybody, I'm Brittany Lewis, one of the hosts here with Forbes TV. Joining me now is Josh Zeman, director of the documentary series The Sons of Sam. Josh, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
This month, if you can believe it, we just passed the 48th anniversary of David Berkowitz's arrest. It's been close to 50 years since the Son of Sam terrorized New York City from the summer of 1976 to the summer of 1977. After all of this time, why do you think there's still so much interest in this case?
That's an excellent question, and one I think we continually ask ourselves over and over again. You know, they say that every generation gets the criminal it deserves. And in the 60s, that was Manson. And in the 70s, that was definitely David Berkowitz. I mean, you had sex, sin, New York City, disco. And so he embodied that for sure. But I think there's also some other things that he may have embodied, a kind of transition from Manson, that kind of evil cult leader, to David Berkowitz, who may not be the evil cult leader, but I think there's many questions as to what really was going on in the case.
And your documentary series really dived into those questions, and it followed not so much David Berkowitz, but really the investigative reporter Maury Terry, who dedicated decades of his life to investigating the Son of Sam case. He thought that David Berkowitz was part of this satanic cult. There were more than one shooters. I mean, when you first heard him, I've listened to your podcast too, and you kind of, it seemed like that, okay, this is kind of someone who went down this rabbit hole and they're being kind of crazy. Then it seemed like you started believing Maury Terry more and more. So can you tell us how you first got involved in this case?
Sure. I did another documentary called Cropsy about some missing kids in my hometown of Staten Island. And there were a number of detectives on that case who started to tell me about another case, that being the Sons of Sam, and maybe some things that the public didn't fully know about that case, and whether the Sons of Sam had its tentacles, if you will, in the Cropsy case. So I started to dig a little bit into the book, The Ultimate Evil. It's a great true crime book. It scared the heck out of me, as did many people. I reached out to Maury Terry, and yeah, he was a little down the rabbit hole, if you will, a little bit conspiratorial. But often when you look at some of these cases, there is some truth to it. You know, the question is, what's the truth? You know, there's Maury Terry's truth, there's my truth, and, you know, what's in the middle?
And I think your series laid out a few separate sets of truth. Like you said, Maury Terry, I mean, he believed with his full heart his theory that Berkowitz was involved in a satanic cult. He wasn't the only shooter. I mean, he spent decades on this. His marriage unraveled and ended in divorce because of this. It seemed like his first love was this case. Then you have the NYPD's chief of detectives, Joseph Borelli. He led the task force in the investigation, and it seemed like he, based on the interviews in your documentary, believed with his full heart that Berkowitz was the lone shooter. He was the only Son of Sam. There's no evidence indicating anything else. I mean, as a documentarian, what is it like interviewing and talking with two separate people with two theories that believe it with their whole heart? or seemingly so?
Seemingly so, but that's an excellent question because it wasn't just Maury Terry and Borelli. It wasn't a one-on-one. There were people in Borelli's camp, or what we call the NYPD camp, and then there were people in Maury Terry's camp. But it wasn't just Maury Terry. There were other investigators. There were Yonkers Police Department, a number of different people. But there are two sides to the story, and as I usually find, the truth is somewhere in the middle. So I think in my investigation, was it a satanic cult? I'm not sure. Maybe that was just theatrics, but was there some nefarious things going on? Were there multiple shooters? I definitely believe there could have been when you dig into the evidence and when you also realize what was going on in New York City at the time. The Son of Sam held New York City captive. It literally brought the Big Apple to its knees. The last time I think anybody in New York City felt that type of fear and everybody stayed in was COVID. So I kept saying, imagine if there was a guy who could end COVID right now by arresting him. Would you really ask any questions once that happened, or would you just be so happy that it was over? And I think that was one of the things that I realized.
And it seemed like people were just happy it was over. People felt safe going out again. People felt safe going to the disco. There was also politics involved. The police had a lot of promotions. There was a mayoral campaign. The mayor was up for re-election. So all of that was at play. And you get presented Maury Terry's research, his years of investigative research here. With his research in your podcast, you described it as always another layer and always never ending. Did you find yourself becoming obsessed with this case?
Oh, absolutely. I've spent years. That is basically the cautionary tale of the Son of Sam case. And Maury Terry isn't the only one. I speak to people all day long who are obsessed with the answers as well. That is, I think, some of the bigger issues with our, quote, true crime obsessions these days, whether it's the Karen Reed case or whether it's the Idaho murders. People tend to get extremely wrapped up. And that was a little bit of my lesson that I wanted to share with the larger public because it happened to me. Be careful with your true crime obsession because it could lead you down a rabbit hole that you may never come out of.
Did you come out of the rabbit hole? I mean, what was the ending for you? Because you've even said that the Son of Sam's last victim was Maury Terry because he passed away in December of 2015. What made you stop? Or are you still investigating it to this day?
To this day, I think numerous things come up. People email me, Facebook all the time. Battles and back and forth between was Maury right, was Maury wrong? I think the one question that I always ask people is, can you please do the research? And that doesn't mean looking on the internet and reading what other people have said. We've come into this echo chamber of information where people are trying to get information about the case and they continue to reread the same things. Some of that investigative work is only over 50 years old. So it's really about going out there and kind of hitting the streets, gumshoeing, if you will, to do your own investigative work.
And I think one of the more important interviews in your documentary series was with Carl De Niro. He was someone who was a victim. He was shot in the head by the Son of Sam. And there was one point in the documentary where he said something essentially like Maury was obsessed with this case. And he was like, wait, and Maury said something to the effect of, this is my case. And then Carl goes, wait, no, it's my case. I mean, I was the one who was shot in the head. I mean, when Carl did say that he believes there are other shooters, does when you heard that, I mean, what did you think when you're hearing that from a victim? Did that solidify Maury's case to you?
It solidified Maury's obsession. But also, yes, Carl still continues to believe that there were other people involved. He was may have been shot by somebody else. The other problem is that we have David Berkowitz himself. David Berkowitz is an enigma. And David Berkowitz, I think, likes to become the center of attention, not from a narcissist standpoint, but from I just want to be seen standpoint. And so I think he also sometimes feels danger in jail or sometimes not. So he tends to change his story. And that story has changed over the years. Originally, he was the only one. Then he said there were others involved. Then he said he's the only one. Then he says the others are involved. So David Berkowitz has a hand as well in perpetuating the mythology and of the case. So that way people never really know the truth. And that's what makes it an endless rabbit hole.
And do you think there's benefit in speaking with people who are convicted of such heinous crimes like David Berkowitz? Because as you said, he's changed his story time and time again over decades. Even in a 2017 interview with Dateline, he kind of dangled a carrot a bit. He left the door open. He said, let's just say essentially there are demons here. And he didn't say no when asked if he was the lone shooter. I mean, do you think there's a benefit in interviewing him? Or do you think there's a benefit maybe more so in focusing more on the victims? Where do you fall?
I think it's very important. First, I'm glad that true crime has evolved. The question is, has it evolved in the right way or the wrong way? Right? So it's gotten a lot crazier, but at the same time, it has gotten a lot more victim-centric. I don't think I would have been as involved in this case if Carl De Niro, the victim, wasn't around, if he didn't believe that he was shot by somebody else. I think a lot of people who still look at the case feel a kinship to Carl, and the fact that he hasn't had closure is important. So that is an important thing, I think, in terms of what's going on. As for David, I don't know, because you mentioned a 2017 interview. There's depositions going back 50 years where he said other people were involved. He's listed people's names who other people are involved. The other thing that I think is a big issue is just because somebody says something in public or sends you an email with some information that you believe, the question is, can you prove it? That really becomes the issue. Can you prove it?
That is a huge issue. And you post on your podcast that this case really is, what do you believe and why? And before we get to what you believe and why, there have been so many documentaries on the Son of Sam. One just came out the past month, and I've watched both. I've watched your documentary series. I also watched that one, and they're two totally separate series. I mean, it's almost like you're watching something on a different case, really. Both, I mean, fascinating. Yours lays out Maury's full theory there. I mean, how, as a documentarian, do you see this case that's infamous for decades, and you decide, here's how I can approach that differently? I mean, what's that like? Because this is a story that's told again, and you found a unique angle to retell it.
It's almost like being a detective yourself in some respects. So Maury Terry has this, and I knew Maury Terry. I would speak to Maury Terry. When Maury Terry was alive, he was always asking me, please do a documentary about this case. And I said, Maury, I don't know if I can. You're too invested in your own story. To be a good documentarian, you have to be open to all possibilities. So as a documentarian, I wanted to be open to all possibilities. Could Son of Sam have acted alone? Could Son of Sam had acted with other individuals? Could there be a satanic cult? Could it be not a satanic cult, but really about the mob and pornography and sex and drugs, which is what usually is? So I wanted to go at it from all these different angles, but it's what I liked is going down all these different rabbit holes to see what was legitimate or what was not. Obviously, as we say, if there's smoke, there's fire. But again, can you prove it?
And I mean, personally, I live in New York City. I know the Son of Sam case. I'm a true crime person who's been consuming this content for decades. And I came in, honestly, watching your series thinking there was one shooter. And Maury Terry laid out a very compelling case. In that time, when you were looking at that, I mean, did you go from, I think there was one shooter, to, I believe Maury Terry a bit here and there? I mean, what was the one piece of evidence to you that kind of changed everything?
That's a great question. I don't think it was one piece, but there was a number of pieces. First of all, if you have a number, and not one crazy old school NYPD guy, but a number of NYPD guys whispering to you like, look, there was more to the case than, what we put out in the public. That kind of sets your spidey sense going, saying, what is it? Then you read Maury Terry's book, and Maury, it almost reads like a thriller. I knew there was no way that this could completely 100% be true, but again, you know that there's nuggets that are true, and you're like, okay, let's look at those nuggets. And there were some compelling issues. There were, and of course, obviously, everybody might say victim statements, eyewitness sketches, unreliable. Completely agree. Completely agree. However, if you look at those and look at them against the Carr brothers, becomes very interesting. Then if you start to look at other interesting facts, how could he be all these different places at once? Then you start to look at the letters, and the letters themselves. There's really some interesting information buried in the letters. He's calling himself the son of Sam. Well, where does he get that? Obviously from a neighbor, Sam Carr. Then if you look at Sam Carr's children, I mean, Sam Carr's kids, John Carr and Michael Carr, they both died. One committed suicide. And before he committed suicide, he said, I have some information that the police are going to want to know. The police never interviewed the quote, son of Sam. I find that to be very interesting. Why didn't they interview him? Because he has died, committed suicide. But there's just too much about John Carr and Michael Carr and the Carr family and Berkowitz's relationship with the Carr family. They live just down the block. There's far too much for it to be 100% coincidence. And as detectives love to tell you, there is no such thing as coincidence. I agree. Now, the question is, how involved were they? And I think that's where I really get into it. Were they one shooter, two shooters? Was it three kind of kids, almost, if you will, just wanting to be nihilist in the 70s and kind of cause havoc and chaos? Could be. Was it part of a larger cult? Maybe. Was the cult just theatrics and it was really about sex, drugs, and rock and roll? Probably.
So you're still questioning, was it a cult? Was it not a cult? I mean, both Carr brothers are dead. Do you think that anyone you think could have been involved? Do you think they're still alive? Do you think they're still involved in crime if there are multiple people? I mean, what does that look like to you?
I think it looks like a bunch of folks in the 1970s who were probably involved in some pretty dark stuff. Whether they were dabbling, they call them dabblers, whether they were dabbling in devil worshiping. What does that really mean? Is it everybody just hanging out in the woods listening to Metallica? Is it everybody, wearing robes? Is it I've spoken to cops who are still alive who investigated the case, and they said to me, it was very interesting. They're like, look, it's all theatrics for sex. And when you look at it like that, it kind of makes sense. It was all just theatrics to kind of get people together to have sex and or to do bad things, go sell drugs, commit other crimes, pornography, what have you. And then the question is, when you get the mob in there, and I think this is one interesting thing. Maury Terry wrote The Ultimate Evil in, I forget, 87, I think. He was early in the case. His ideas changed. What he thought the case was really about changed. And that happens to me too, whether it's the Long Island serial killer case, whether it's the Cropsey documentary that I did. Your ideas change about what the crime is really about. And I think as he got older in life, he realized it was more about the mob and kind of a darker influence of the mob, whether it was like hits for profit or what have you.
And I mean, like you've said, I feel like this is layers. It's almost like an onion, right? your evidence, your investigation, Maury Terry's decades-long investigation, it's like peeling one thing back. And when you get to one level, then there's another one underneath it. When you've watched other documentaries, when you've seen David Berkowitz's latest interview in 2017, I mean, does your mind change at all? Do you see how they approach it and say, I didn't think of that? Or you think, hey, I did think of that, and I'm sticking by the way I tell the story?
I think that's a good question, too, because it's not like we've ever changed the original narrative. And when I sat with Berkowitz, I went and sat with Berkowitz many times to ask him to be on camera, to say, you were friends with Maury Terry. How come you didn't tell the whole truth? And he even shocked me with things that he said. He said, well, I did actually believe that there was a possessed dog. So it's interesting, and new facts emerge. it's a mixture of mental illness. David Berkowitz had a lot of family issues going on, so I think it's a lot of those issues as well. But even Berkowitz surprised me with new information. Look, I think one of the worst things you can ever do, whether you're a documentarian, a detective, news, what have you, is have a formed opinion and not be open to new information, because then you're not doing everybody justice. You're just obstinate in some respects. And so I always look at everything with a open mind and say, could I be wrong? Absolutely. But still, I'm looking for convincing questions as to why certain things didn't happen. Why didn't the police interview the son of Sam? Why did this is an interesting one, by the way. Why did the Queens District Attorney reopen the investigation? A Queens District Attorney in the late 80s, early 90s does not reopen the son of Sam investigation unless there is cause to reopen that investigation, because that is a political wormhole. He would never do it. So I, in fact, just spoke to one of the chief investigators and saying, oh, come on my podcast, let's get back into it. And he's like, what's it going to do? What's it going to help? I was like, well, look, people need to know that you guys actually went through Santucci's office, who was the DA at the time, reinvestigated this case. That's pretty important. He's like, yes, for sure. And a lot of what Maury said was right. A lot of what Maury Terry said was wrong. So I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to give you or your audience the answers that are truly going to satisfy them. And I said, that's so confounding.
And I think that's why this case is sticking with people, right? Because there's still more new tidbits, even 48 years later. And I think part of the surprise when David Berkowitz was arrested was people did not think that who he was squared with these horrible crimes just based on the way he looked, right? He was about 5'8", 5'9". People said, that doesn't look like a serial killer, really. I
think he was like 5'6", 5'5".
Yeah, maybe I'm probably being generous here. Yeah, so either way, on the shorter side,
he had extra 3 inches.
Yeah, on the shorter side, didn't look like what people envisioned this monster in their mind. When you sat with him, I mean, what was most surprising to you?
Honestly, he was just kind of schlubby. And it changed my perspective. It didn't really change my perspective, but it solidified my perspective, which is David Berkowitz was somebody who could be manipulated. It's like, give it to Mikey. Mikey likes it. Mikey will try anything. Maybe sex was a motivator. Companionship was a motivator. Friendship was a motivator. Actually, a lot of things that work in cults, to be honest with you, in terms of bringing wayward people together. So that was interesting for me to see him. And, I was like, you could get out of jail, right? There's enough problems, in fact, in your original sentencing, where the DA had said he was going to get a deal if he went into a mental institution. If he confessed he was going to go into a mental institution. What happened was there were all these protests, and then suddenly the DA flipped the deal on him, and Berkowitz went nuts in the courtroom and yelled crazy stuff. So I said, you could get out. And he's like, no, I like it here. He's found God and he's a minister. So I think that's interesting too. When you think about giving yourself a role later in life and making yourself important.
And I mean, sitting with him, is there a feeling, because I've never talked to someone who's been convicted of being a serial killer. So is there a sense of, hey, I'm trying to square with what you're saying you did with the crimes you were charged and ultimately convicted of with who I'm sitting across from right now?
Well, good. That kind of goes back to your original question, right?
Yeah.
Meaning, when Berkowitz was arrested, even the mayor himself, the first comment from the mayor is, well, he doesn't look like the guy that we were always looking for. Literally, his first question, his first answer. So there was always, there's two sides of that answer, right? There's always, well, this guy doesn't quite look like who we think a serial killer is. And then it's actually David Berkowitz actually doesn't look like who we thought the perpetrator was. There's two, so there were two issues. And then you look at all the pictures and I even went in and re-interviewed and listened to some of the original suspects. talking about whether he was left-handed or was right-handed, and listened to the tapes, and they were like, well, John Carr was right-handed. I forget what the detail was, but the woman, when she was telling the detective, she was only 15 years old, she had said it was the left arm, but then when you flip it around and look at it from on her side, it's actually the right, so I was like, wait a second, what they're saying, why it couldn't be David Berkowitz, it actually could be David Berkowitz. So there were just so many different factors, but there was, if you can believe this, no post-arrest investigation into the Carr brothers, which I find to be crazy, because in this day and age, if we have somebody who confesses to a crime, we are going to do an incredible amount of post-arrest investigation to discern whether this person, what the truth was. And it was really more like, he admits it, everybody kind of, or he gets caught, he admits it, there's a huge party, they're planning like where to get the alcohol, they're not, and the DAs are just kind of shuffling in to get his confession, all the 5 different DAs. Everybody wants time with David Berkowitz because he had committed crimes in all different suburbs, so that's another issue. And then it was over.
And I think a lot of responses from law enforcement who are adamant that he's the one shooter, including Borelli himself, would be, well, there were no more shootings after Berkowitz was locked up. I mean, what do you think? When you hear that, I mean, what do you say to that? And especially like as a documentarian, you're sitting there in the interview. What's your answer to that?
I mean, look, it's just logic. We're not saying Berkowitz wasn't involved. We're just saying that there were other people who were either a shooter for a number of crimes or periphery involved. Like, go have David Berkowitz shoot this person, go have Berkowitz shoot this person. And sometimes it was Berkowitz for sure, and sometimes it was other people. So when they say the shooting stopped, I agree. Yes, of course, the shootings did stop. By the way, there are a number of police officers who do believe that there were more involved in David Berkowitz. That's how I got into the case, was there were a number of different people. I think there's a large consensus out there. Large consensus, I don't know. There's a strong, vehement group of people who just believe it was part of a devil-worshipping cult, and that's the part that I don't believe. I think it was sex, drugs, and rock and roll with the cult as a kind of smokescreen, as a kind of theatrics. As I say, you can either pay people to do really bad stuff, or you can tell them it's part of a cult and get them to do it for free.
Yeah, I mean, this really came at the time of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. As you said, the media was all over this story. The son of Sam was sending letters to the police, to the media. They were being published. Do you think true crime would be the way it is today without the son of Sam case?
I think that's such an important and prescient point that you just made. It wouldn't be, because son of Sam allowed Rupert Murdoch, who owned the Post at the time, to realize that fear sells better than sex.
That was something, as a journalist, when I was watching this and hearing the way the reporters were reporting on this case and the phrases they would use. I mean, almost 50 years later, I'm sitting there and I thought, I could never talk this way. I don't hear my peers talking this way. No one would talk in this sensationalist language. I mean, that was one of my biggest takeaways as a journalist, but keep going.
Well, no, I mean, it's an important point. Like, I wasn't just looking, by the way, at Maury Terry. I was looking at journalism and true crime as a whole, and this moment that kind of kickstarted it off. By the way, son of Sam not only solidified careers, launched even a style of journalism. First of all, who was there making their bones in the son of Sam case? Geraldo Rivera, number one for sure. You had him sending letters to Jimmy Breslin. That was huge, solidifying this giant. You had the Post and the Daily News in a huge battle, and basically Rupert Murdoch realizes the son of Sam is his golden ticket to making the New York Post what it is, and he goes in 100%, and he sends in these tabloid journalists, these Aussies who come over, no holds barred journalists, all right, man, tell me what is luck with the son of Sam. It was great. And that really made Rupert Murdoch. But it also did something else. Just 2 or 3 years later, Current Affairs is launched. It started tabloid TV. So that was the other, that you had Geraldo, Now It Could Be Told. You had Current Affairs starting. So it wasn't just selling newspapers. It was, as you said, a new type of sensationalistic journalism that then carried over to where we are today. Now, you can even, and a number of people have done this, they have basically drawn a straight line from Berkowitz to Trump presidency, saying that this type of sensationalistic journalism has now it's the same type of journalism now we're seeing seeping into American politics. It's no longer Tom Brokaw and Peter Jennings and that style of stodgy journalism. Now it's more of the Fox style journalism that we're seeing in American politics. That started all the way back in Berkowitz.
I mean, that's great. That's a crazy through line to even think. Do you think that without Berkowitz, there'd be a Trump presidency? I mean, it's almost like the butterfly effect here.
It could be, well, I think the bigger question is, could there be a Trump presidency without New York City true crime? Without New York City crime in the Post? Because remember, it's not just Berkowitz, it's Bernie Getz, it's Central Park 5. I think Trump was always smart enough to be commentary on the big true crime case at the time. So, but yeah, you can draw that direct line, at least to the sensationalism of journalism that would happen. And Maury Terry even has a role in that. I like to say that Maury Terry made a deal with the devil. The problem, and I think Maury Terry was, it's hard to say percentage-wise, but like 65% right, or even 70% right. Like, I believe there were other people involved, and to me, that's the biggest thing. For many other people, they're like, no, it was a devil worshiping cult, and I don't get into that stuff. But I think for the most part, Maury Terry was right, but I think Maury went off the rails a little bit. And what I mean by that is he knew he had some nuggets of truth that Berkowitz didn't act alone. And the NYPD called him crazy. And you see this happening in media today. When people have a theory, whether a conspiracy theory or not, and somebody else calls them crazy, they double down. And then they start to get more angry about their case, more fervent about their case, and then they start to break a little bit of rules of proper journalism and etiquette. So I think Maury kind of doubled down when he would have just kind of stuck to his guns and been the better person. He could have been, some of his information would have been better received in the long run.
And you said that on your podcast that you thought Maury Terry made a deal with the devil, but the devil always wins. And I cover a lot of breaking news. I cover a lot of developing stories. And something I always say at my last question to my guests is, what do you think's next? And I can't believe I'm asking you about a case that has been closed, that it's been almost over 50 years or close to 50 years since the last shooting. I mean, what do you think is next for the Son of Sam case in American culture, I guess, would be my question.
I don't know. That's a great question. I don't know, because at this point, there is no baseline truth. I don't know. There was always, this is one of the things that we try to look at in our documentary, right? There was always the narrative of the talking dog. But I don't know if we've gotten over that baseline to believe that there's other people or not. Tragically, I think, unfortunately, David Berkowitz is probably going to pass away, and we'll never know the absolute truth.
Well, Josh, I appreciate our conversation. I hope that everyone watches your documentary series, The Sons of Sam. It's been on Netflix now since 2021, and also your companion podcast as well. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope we can have more conversations in the future.
Absolutely. It's a great case.
Awesome. Thank you.
Take care.